All right, so first of all, thank you all for coming out here today. I'm amazed how many people wanted to learn about policies. I guess the lesson here is put ninja in your title next time. So hopefully you're here, though, let me just switch this over. Hopefully you're here because you're interested in identity and access management. You want to learn how to secure the resources in your AWS account, and you want to master the IAM policy language. My name is Jeff Weir. I'm a senior manager on the identity and access management team, and I hope to, in the next 60 minutes, get us all up to speed and become policy ninjas. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to go through quite a few JSON documents. So I'll make this one last request. If it's hard for you to see, I will encourage you to come up. Also, if an hour of looking at JSON documents is not how you want to spend your morning, good news is, it's not too late. There's a lot of great sessions, and you won't hurt my feelings. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. What to expect from this session. Really, if you walk away with one thing that you learned in terms of how to secure your account, something you didn't know about policies, a tool to debug, something like that, I think that it's a mission accomplished. Now, the way I structured this presentation is based off the fact that every day I try to spend some time helping customers, whether it's in our forums, getting on the calls with somebody, working through support tickets, and that experience has afforded me to see a lot of creative policies and a lot of things that customers have attempted to do but could not figure out how to do. Quite honestly, sometimes it took me a few days to figure out how to create the policy. So I'm going to share what I have learned over the last 3.5 years at Amazon, and hopefully, this is a session about policies. I'm going to try to keep it as lively as possible. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to go through the demonstrations. I'm going to show you how the policies work, and I'm going to describe to you line by line what they're actually doing. So with that, let's go into the first demonstration. Now, this was an actual customer use case. I didn't make this up. Customer filed a ticket because they couldn't figure out how to do it, and they had a very simple requirement. They wanted their developers to be able to launch EC2 instances, but they wanted to be able to control costs. So they just said, I just want to be able to launch instances as long as they're a T1, a T2, or an M3. So I'm going to walk you through the process of how they attempted to create that policy and then attach it to an IAM user. Now, as we go through the presentation through the day, I'm going to change personas, and I'm going to stay as the administrator in Chrome, and the user is always going to be in Firefox, and that way I don't have to keep logging in and out. And so right now I'm logged in as the administrator, and for those of you who've not used IAM before, you go in here, you click users, and I have Bob. I'm sure you've heard about Bob before, and Bob's not attached to any groups. He doesn't have any permissions. He's got an access key and a password, and that's about it. So I want to create a policy for Bob, and I'm going to go ahead and create a policy. I'm going to use the policy generator because it makes life easier. And remember, we want them to be able to launch instances, but only to certain types. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to grant access to EC2. I'm going to give them access to all actions and all resources. I'm going to add that statement. Now I want to lock it down, so I'm going to deny, in this case, access to EC2, but I'm going to limit it to a specific action, which is run instances, which is the action or the API that is required to launch an instance with EC2. Now I want to put some conditions on top of this. Specifically, I want to check that the string is not like, for an instance type of T1 star, T2 star, M3 star. So I'm going to add that condition. I'm going to add the statement. And the nice thing about the policy generator is it generates the JSON for me, right? So I don't have to remember. So that's one small tip. Hopefully a bunch of you have already done that before. And I'm just going to give this a name before I forget. So I'll call it Demo 1. And there's a few things that I like to clean up just around the policy, especially if I have single item lists or arrays. Don't really need the brackets. So I'm just going to kill a bunch of stuff here just so it's easier on your eyes. By the way, I warned you about not being able to see in the back, so no feedback. Oh, I couldn't see what he was doing. Yeah. I could zoom. Let's see. We'll do that. Zoom a little. I don't know if that helped much. Yeah. All right, keep the comments coming. Real-time feedback appreciated. Now, I left an error in there just to kind of show you what happens. And you go through and it validates, and it tells you it had some type of JSON error. Now, I'll steal the show. I put a comma in there. But now when you validate the policy, oh, wait, did I put another error in there? Oh, yeah, forgot the comma here, too. Okay, so now the policy is valid. So this is something that we didn't have a year ago. The other thing I'll show you is that you can use formatting, so it makes it pretty. And now it's a little bit easier. I'm allowing all EC2 actions on all resources, and I'm denying this one action when the instance type does not match T1, T1, T2, or M3. Okay, so I'm going to create that policy. I'm going to go back to our buddy Bob, and I'm going to attach that policy, and I called it reInvent. Oh, see, now that's why I know you can't see anything when you do that. Yep, there we go. Attach the policy, and just to kind of prove it, you can show that this policy is attached to them. And so now I'm going to switch roles over in Firefox now, and I'm Bob. And Bob's going to go over to the EC2 console. He's going to try to launch an instance. And let's look at the fail case first, because we wanted to prevent him from launching anything that wasn't of those 3 instance types. So I'm just going to take an M4 here, review and launch. Sure, launch. I acknowledge. Boom. Error message, right? Get this lovely encoded error message. So that was expected because we didn't want Bob to be able to launch that instance. So let's go back, choose an instance type that's allowed. I'll choose the T2 micro, review and launch. I'm just going to click through a bunch of these things that warn me, yes, I acknowledge, launch, and boom, error message. So, yeah, I think we'd all agree that that was a fail. And the reason I show you that is this is the logical process that people typically go through. And this was a customer who knew what they were doing. They were experienced. And probably a bunch of you are still saying, wait, why didn't that work? There may be some ninjas in the room who already know. But it's not enough to just understand the syntax and the grammar of the language. You actually have to understand how the authorization model works with the various services, in this case EC2. And that's what I'm going to hopefully give you guys some insight about today, and I will show you the success case towards the end of the presentation. Now, because there are some people who are new to policies, I'm going to try to go through the basics, and I'm going to do it as fast as possible, just to give us all a baseline. But the policy language is around authorization. There's just 2 facets. There's the language, the syntax, the grammar. And then there's the important piece, the enforcement. How is it actually used by the AWS services that you want to access or deny access? And that's the piece that is the most important part of really trying to start mastering creating permissions inside of AWS. Now, all these policies, as you've already seen, are JSON documents. They contain statements. Sometimes I'll call them permissions. These permissions follow a certain model. I like to create policies that follow the PARC model. Stands for principal, action, resource, and condition. There's also an effect. The effect is simply an allow or deny. eParc really doesn't roll off the tongue, so I just generally say there's PARC plus an effect. Now, I want to go through each of the 4 pieces pretty quickly just so that you know what it is you're looking at. So when I say principal, I really mean it's an actor, right? It's an entity. It's something that is going to be allowed or denied access to a resource. And the way that you indicate these in policies is by their ARN. If you never know what an ARN stands for, it's just the Amazon resource name, right? There's going to be 2 types of policies that you're going to encounter. Policies that are attached to users, groups, and roles, and policies that are attached to the resources, like a bucket. Those that are the user groups and roles, those are IAM policies. Now, when you create an IAM policy, we know who the principal is. It's attached to the user, it's attached to the group, it's attached to the role. However, if it's a resource-based policy, you're going to have to specify who the principal is. And so here, I'll give you a few common principles. So let's say that you have an object in a bucket, like an image or something, and you want to share it with the world because it's part of a website, right? Then you can use the anonymous or everyone has access, star.star. You may have multiple AWS accounts. You may need to share data with other AWS customers. In that case, you would specify the account ARN. You can either put the 12-digit code or you can put in the full root ARN. They both work the same. Of course, I'd prefer that you use IAM users, since I work in identity and access management, and you can scope down those with permissions. And so this is what a user ARN looks like. And of course, you may be granting access to resources in your account as part of an application, maybe using Cognito or something, and using a Facebook user or a Google user or something of that matter, and this is what those federated users would look like. Of course, we have IAM roles. IAM roles look a lot like the IAM user ARN, except it's a role. And then last but not least are service ARNs. People tend not to know about the service ARNs. So how many of you have launched an EC2 instance with a role? Everybody, right? Yeah, okay. When you do that, you are granting access to the EC2 team to assume that role. And so there is actually a service principal for each of the services, and for EC2, it's EC2 Amazon AWS.com. Now, most of the tooling does that for you, but that's what's happening behind the scenes. And of course, these are dummy numbers. So you want to replace these with your 12-digit account ID if you want to use any of these in an actual policy. Now, action is what you want that principal to be able to do. And I apologize in advance, I'll probably interchangeably say action and API just because there's pretty much a 99% correlation between the two. However, there are some actions like IAM pass role where there is no equivalent API. But for the purpose of this presentation, I will say action and API interchangeably. Now, if you want to get, I don't know, there's like over 2,000 of these actions, and I haven't memorized them all. So you can get them from the tooling, like the policy generator like I did. You can look in the docs, they're all there. Or you can use the policy simulator, which we'll take a look at. Now, all statements have to have an action or a not action. And I haven't talked about nots yet. You can have not principles, not actions, not resources. Not actions are the most interesting one, and so I'll spend an entire slide on it. But here's what some of the actions look like. Now, hopefully you've used some of these before. This is just EC2, IAM, and S3. Now, a couple more interesting things about the languages. You can specify more than one action. And when you do, you're creating an array, and you need to encapsulate that in square brackets. Now, to make it easier, we also allow wildcards. So we have two of them. One is the asterisk. This is the multi-character wildcard. And we have the question mark, which is a single-character wildcard. And this will allow you to create tighter policies that don't have big, long lists. So for example, here by using IAM star access key star, what I am doing is I'm granting or denying access to create, delete, list, or update access key. And so this is a way to create tighter policies, because as anybody who's created some policies, you've probably hit a policy limit. And so size does matter. You got to laugh. It's not going to get better. So let's talk about not action. Because a lot of people, a lot of customers I talk to are a little bit confused about what I mean by that. So when you're using not, especially with an action, what you're doing is you're saying, here's an exception to a list of things, right? And this, once again, is going to help you create shorter, tighter policies. So let's say, for example, you want to grant a user access to everything in AWS, but you don't want them to have administrative privileges. So you want to exclude IAM star. You could create a very short policy like this. So the effect is allow, not action IAM star, so give me everything that is not IAM on every resource, okay? Or you could do it this way. They're both pretty short. One of them grants, the other one grants access to everything, and then denies, takes away the ability to call IAM star. So here's a question. Is there a difference? Yes? No? Yes, the yes is right. Here's the subtle difference. So a lot of people think not action is the equivalent of a deny. It's an exclusion, and it's a subtle difference, right? So if I had this policy attached to a user, and then I mistakenly added them to the administrator group, they would get admin rights. However, if I made the same mistake with the policy on the right, the deny would trump the allow. And so if you absolutely wanted to deny access to a user, you'd either use the policy on, I guess, I don't know what it is, my right as I'm looking at it, or you do a combination of the two. And so there is a difference. So resources are easy. These are the objects or objects that you want to allow the actor to request. And your statement's always going to include a resource or a not resource. And so here's some basic ones for a bucket, a queue. I give you an example of a list of DynamoDB tables because they're really big. And then the last one's interesting. I'll just point it out here. Customers ask me this all the time. How do I limit access to a specific region? And so you can see here, they may say, oh, I only want to operate in US East. And in there, I want access to all instances. And so this is the resource that you would specify in there to lock them to a certain region. Of course, if say you wanted to run in US East and US West, you would just make a list of those. Someone's doing well. They're killing it. The last part is, we got to be a little bit competitive, right? We get some clapping and just simultaneously clap for some reason. Take that, next door. All right. So the condition. Presentation's going sideways. Conditions. Conditions are important because they allow you to add this additional criteria. Now, it's optional criteria, but in most cases, you need these additional conditions in order to really make the policy do what you want it to do. Now, conditions can be a little bit tricky to understand. So, in the simplest case, you can have a single condition, but you can actually add multiple conditions to the statement. And so I have here a condition 1 and a condition 2, and then those conditions can have multiple values, right? So when the policy starts to look like this, how do you evaluate it? So the key here is if you have a single condition, okay, and that condition includes multiple values like the condition 1 does, those conditions are evaluated using logical OR. So that one single statement says that key 1 must be one of those 3 values. However, you can also have multiple conditions or multiple keys in a single condition, right? And in those cases, the conditions are evaluated using logical AND. So why didn't we just put operators in there for AND and OR? I don't know. This predates me. But this is how it evaluated. So the way that this policy reads is the condition will be true if key 1 is any of those 3 values, and key 2 is any of those 2 values, and key 3 is that single value. If any of those things are false, the entire policy, or I should say the entire statement for that policy, is treated as false. Now, if that was completely confusing, let's take a look at a real example. So let's say that we wanted to have a condition that had to be October 8th, which today it is. It has to be before 3 p.m., which it is, and let's just assume we're coming from one of these 2 cider blocks, okay? The other condition is the time has to be after noon, and I haven't gone on that long, so this policy would actually fail one of the conditions, therefore the entire policy that's attached, or the entire statement attached to this condition would be false, okay? So hopefully that clears up conditions a bit. Policy variables. We introduced policy variables a couple years ago, and they really are lifesavers in terms of creating tighter, smaller policies. Before policy variables, you had to create policies and you had to put static strings in there, and if you wanted one for Bob and you wanted for Sally, you had to create a copy of it and maintain them separately. And so you really want to start using variables if you're not using them in there. And they're based off of existing keys. So we just looked at source IP and current time, okay? But if you're using an IAM user, there's keys in there that you can use for variables as well, as username, user ID, principal type. Of course, if you're using federation, either via Cognito, this is what the Facebook and the Amazon IDs look for. And if you're using the security assertion markup or SAML, you're going to have the audience and the issuer. Now, all these variables are defined by us, so you can't create your own variable. And there's way too many for me to list in this presentation. So if you want to see the list of them, you're going to have to go to the server-specific documentation and look at the variables that are available for that service. And there's a couple use cases here that I'll go through to kind of demonstrate how you can use these variables. So there's a couple things I want to point out. The first one is that when you create a policy with a variable, you have to have this version. Now, if you're going through the policy generator now, we stuff it in there for you automatically. If you've been a customer of ours for a few years and you have older policies, you probably don't have that version in there. And so if you're anything like me, you go and you create a policy, you forget to put that in there, it doesn't work, and you go, oh, it's broken. I did this over and over when we were building this feature. And all the developers come smack me on the head and say, you didn't put the version in there, and of course it works. So what happens if you don't put the version? It treats all the variables as literals, i.e., policy is not going to do what you think it's going to do. Now here's, I'm using the IAM username. So if this was Bob, this variable would resolve to Bob, okay? And you can use those variables in conditions, and you can use those variables as part of a resource ARN as well. A little bit on managing policies. So as I mentioned, we have IAM policies, and we also have resource-based policies. And as you dig into IAM policies, there's two types or two ways to manage them. I like to refer to this as the older way and the newer way. So earlier this year, we introduced something called managed policies. And if you haven't taken a look at managed policies, after you're done here, if you have your laptop open, I encourage you to take a look at these. These are much better over the previous inline policies that we had. When you use a managed policy, you create a policy once, you can attach it to users, groups, and roles. And if you want to update that policy, you update it one time, i.e. you set it and forget it, and you don't have to do the copy and pasting from users to groups that you had to do in the past. We also introduced AWS managed policies. A good example of that is the reader policy. So as AWS introduces new services, new APIs, as we occasionally do, if you had an operator group that needed access to all those immutable APIs, read, describe, list, get, whatever, you would have to keep adding those APIs and keeping up with us as we release things. If you instead attach the reader policy from AWS, we do all the maintenance. You set it one time, we'll continue to add all those APIs, and there's nothing you need to do. And there's a whole set of managed policies that we provide. Of course, you can create your own policies that you create. Those policies are limited to 5K in size, and you can also version those policies. So if you create a policy and it's working, and then you go and change it, and of course you broke something, you can do rollback on that as well. You can attach 10 managed policies to each user, group, and role. And the nice thing about it is you can put authorization around these managed policies as well. So one of the scenarios we're going to look at is I want to create a limited admin who can create users and do all that great stuff, but they can only set certain permissions. Managed policies enable that. So we also support inline policies. Easy way to think about inline policies is it doesn't support any of that stuff in managed policies. You have to copy and paste every policy to the user, group, and role. And there's different size limits based on whether you're putting a policy on the user, the group, or role. Now, there are some cases like, hey, you just want to test something quick, an inline policy is quick and simple. But for the most part, if you haven't taken a look at managed policies, I encourage you to create all your new policies as managed policies, and then as you need to migrate your existing inline policies as well. Now, those are all for IAM policies, right? And those live with the user, groups, and roles. There's a whole set of other policies called resource policies that live with the resource itself. Good example of those are S3, Glacier, SNS, and SQS, who have bucket, vault, and topic, and queue policies. Now, the major difference here is you need to specify the principal, because in this case, we don't know who you're granting access to. So there has to be an actor in there. In this case here, we're using the AWS root account 111122223333. And it's a good reminder here. I just talked about all the benefits of the managed policies. One downside is you can't use managed policies with resource-based policies. So if you're creating a bucket policy, that policy is going to live with the bucket, which sort of makes sense, right? Because it only applies to that bucket. But just a good thing to point out here. Okay, so I've gone on, and let's look at all those examples that I promised. Specifically, we're going to look at S3, IAM, and EC2. So the first one that I get asked a lot about is creating a home directory using S3. So a lot of customers want to be able to allow their end users to use S3 sort of as a file storage service, kind of like document storage. But they may have hundreds, thousands of users, and of course, you're limited to the number of buckets you can create. So you can't create a bucket per user, right? So what they want to do is use a single bucket and then specify a folder, which is actually a prefix in S3 terminology, and allow the user to log into the AWS Management Console, go to that bucket, and only have access to that specific prefix. So let's take a look at that. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I attach this policy from Bob. And this time I'll go and add him to a group because I created a bunch of reInvent groups. It's kind of like one of those cooking shows where you have it half-baked. So I'm going to give him access to the reInvent S3 home folders group. And now he's a member of that group. And there's the policy. Don't try to see it here. I'll show it in a slide and walk through step by step what it's actually doing. And now, before I added him to the policy, Bob experience was access denied. Right? So I'm going to refresh now because I've applied that policy. And let Firefox do its thing. Okay, so I'll pause here for a second. So this is one of the things, if you're trying to use the S3 console as an end user tool, they're going to see all the buckets. This is just the way the tool works. So a lot of people say, hey, can I hide those buckets? Short answer, no. But they can't get into it. So if Bob tries to get into my documents folder, he's going to get, sorry, you don't have permissions to view this bucket. However, he can go into the test bucket, which is what I granted him access to. He cannot get into the finance folder. He can get into his home folder. Can't get into Craig's folder. He can get into his folder where he keeps images of my daughter. So let's just assume Bob is kind of a family friend, and this is cool. It's not like the creepy scenario. And so you can see that Bob can now store pictures of my kid in that test bucket. So that was a pretty easy one, but let's break down the policy, okay, and look step by step what's actually happening there. So I'm just going to reiterate, you need the version in order for the variables to work, because I'm using variables in it. Now the first two statements are really about the necessary permissions to get in through the S3 console. So if you look at the top here, it says list all my buckets and get bucket location. These are the first two APIs that the S3 console asks for. It does this automatically. There's no way to stop it. And so you must grant the user permissions to do that if you want to use the console. And what you're basically saying is you can see a list of all the bucket names. Now, if you don't want that, there's a lot of third-party tools out there that you might want to consider that would just give them access to a single bucket. And the next thing I'm going to point out here is that I'm giving access to the S3 list bucket API. Now, the list bucket API is an interesting one. If you've actually called the API, you know that it takes a target of the bucket ARN, and then it filters based on a prefix. And so what I'm saying is here is you can call list bucket on this bucket when the prefix matches exactly null home / with a delimiter of /, which is a default delimiter for the S3 console. It took me a day to figure that out. Okay. It's in the documentation now, but it took me a day to figure that one out. The next one is what's going to allow you to list all the objects in that prefix or that folder, or all the, what you can think of as subfolders. And once again, this is list bucket on the bucket ARN, but I need to use a different condition. And so we know that when you mix and match conditions, it's a set of ands or ors. And so I created this as a separate statement so that here I could use a string like as opposed to a string equals. And that's because I'm going to use Bob, which is going to be variable. We don't know what it's going to resolve to. And I'm using a wildcard. And so you have to use string like instead of string equals. Last but not least, I need to be able to call all the other S3 actions. Right? Get object, put object, delete object. And those are interesting APIs because they don't take a target of a bucket, they take a target of the full resource ARN. And so that's why you have to break this up into multiple statements here. And this last one basically says you can have access to the root of that folder, or you can have access to all the subfolders or all the objects in that folder. Right? Any of you guys who are S3 experts, what I'm really saying is you can get all the objects in that bucket that match a certain prefix filter. Okay, so that's how you grant access to a folder, home folder in S3. Now what about creating a limited IAM administrator? I get this one quite a bit too. We wrote a blog post about it, and at the end I have some links to those. So imagine you have a project and you want to designate one of the users. Let's say his name is Bob. And Bob needs to be able to create other IAM users, create keys, set passwords, do all that stuff. But you don't want Bob creating real administrators with full rights. You only want Bob to be able to assign permissions that are specific for your project. This is where managed policies come in. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a group of policies that use variables, and I'm going to grant Bob access to a couple policies, and he's going to have the ability to go into the IAM console and create users, and he can only set permissions using those two policies. So once again, I'll switch over here, and I'm going to remove him from this group, and I'm going to add him to another group. And that was the limited admin group. Good naming. And now you can see here, by adding him to that group, he has actually got access to two policies. One of them is a set of permissions that give him access to the IAM console. So just like the S3 console, there's a number of APIs that it calls automatically that they have to have access to, or they're going to get access denied even getting into the console. The other policy, this one grants him all the things he needs to do. Create users, set passwords, and then down here set the policies. I will show you these in PowerPoint so that a human can read them. And so now Bob has these rights, and if I switch over to Bob, now he can go to the IAM console. Now keep in mind, Bob doesn't have full IAM rights, so he's going to see some access denied. But what he can do is he can go to the users, he can create a new user. Let's call that new user Craig. And I'll create, and I could show you the security credentials, but I'm not going to do that. Let's assume that I download these. And then Craig's created. Craig's going to need a password. So I can assign a password. No, I'm not typing password. Now he's got a password. And now I want to be able to attach permissions. So I'm going to attach a policy. And you couldn't see it in the policy, but what I did is I gave him access to the DynamoDB full access, and this is an AWS managed policy. You can tell because it has the little orange box there. So he's able to attach that policy. And then I also gave him access to that S3 home folder. So I attached that one, and you can see it. Now if Bob tries to be sneaky, and he's like, I'm just going to create an administrator account. Try to attach that policy, doesn't work. Okay, you see, he can only do what we've defined. This wasn't possible before we had managed policies. And so now let me log out. And I'm going to sign back in. This time is Craig. Close a bunch of things. And I gave him access to DynamoDB. I also gave him access to S3. So if I go over here, you can see that he indeed has access to see those tables. And if I were to select one, he could explore the table. Not a whole lot in there, just proving that the permissions work. Of course, he's got the same experience in S3 that Bob does, where he can go into the test bucket. He can go into the home folder. Can't see pictures of my kid. However, he can go into his folder where there is really nothing to see. So just kind of proving that you can create these limited administrative roles. And I'm going to quickly sign back in as Bob because he's not done. Okay, so let me get to, I'll walk through this policy, and then I'll get to like one of my favorite parts. So once again, you have to have the version up there, okay? Here's the set of permissions that allows creating that user, manage the keys, setting the passwords. These are pretty straightforward. You just grant the IAM actions for those. But the only one that's maybe a little bit confusing is create login profile and delete login profile. That's create password and delete password. The rest of them are pretty straightforward. The second part of it down here is where we grant the ability to attach or detach a policy. Specifically, he can only attach the reInvent policy for the S3 home folder that I created, or the policy for DynamoDB full access. And we did a complete write-up. Here's the short URL if you want to read about that on the AWS security blog. Now, as I mentioned, there's a set of rights that you also have to grant to the user just to get into the IAM console in the first place. So if you want to see that list of users, they have to have access to all of the users and call a list user. The other permission you need to do is it fills out that table with some information around who the user is, whether they have a password, what groups they're a member of, if they have keys. And so if you want that table to completely fill out, you'll have to grant access to each of those for each of the users. In that case, you can just use the user variable because that will resolve each role to the user's name for that role. Okay, this is the part I probably get asked the most about, is how do I do all this with EC2? So if any of you were customers of ours a couple years ago, you knew that previously all policies applied to all EC2 resources. So you wanted to grant the ability for someone to terminate an instance. You had to grant them the ability to terminate all instances in all regions in your entire account. Now permissions can be set on a per resource. So for example, you can say, hey, you can start, stop, and terminate just this particular instance, or just this instance that matches a particular tag. And so this is what it used to look like before. And we were sad, and yes, there is a better way. And so now instead of having a star in there, you can put in an ARN. And this is what an instance ID, if you want to say, hey, I got this thing, and this is the developer instance, and this is all you have access to. Likewise, we talked about this a little bit earlier. You could grant them access to all of the instances in a certain region. So this one says, hey, you have access to everything that is in US East 1. You can go one step further, right? Because you can tag your EC2 instances. You could have a tag on there that says, this is my department tag, and this is dev. And so if I'm a developer, and those instances are in US East 1, and they're tagged with dev, then you have access to it. Now the key with EC2 resource permissions is it supports a lot of resource types, but not all of them. And so there's a part of the documentation that has a table. I literally open that up in one window when I'm creating policies for EC2. And so here's the list of resource types that it supports. I put it only there in a reference along with all the supported actions. And so I'll point out that some of the actions that are not supported here are like describe, list, all of those actions. And so a lot of times people will say, hey, can I filter on, describe instances? The short answer is no, you can't. It's not supported. And so it's key that you understand the nuances of what is supported and what is not in order to create an effective policy. And this goes back to some of the policies that, the first policy that we looked at, why didn't that policy work? And so as I mentioned, you can tag your resources, and a lot of people do this for organizational reasons, or they tag it because they want to have a certain department or cost center. But these are great for also doing authorization as well. And so let's look at how we can use tags as a way to prevent a user from doing something in the system. And so specifically, I want to limit a user from starting, stopping, or terminating an instance unless the instance is owned by that user. And so I'm going to show you how you add a tag to an EC2 instance. I'll show you a policy that grants a user access to the EC2 console. And then, of course, we're going to use a policy that uses the username variable to limit what that user can do in the system. And so once again, I'll go in as the administrator, and I will remove Bob from this group. And I believe I have another group in here. Yeah, the EC2 owner. Add them to that group. There's one policy in here. It's a pretty simple policy with 2 statements, but like the others, I'll break it down in the presentation. And so now Bob has access to that. And so if I switch over to Bob, and I go over into EC2, and I go in there as running instances. I'll just show you a couple things that I find people still don't know. So there's this owner column, right? And so you can show and hide columns based on tags. Like everybody already know this? Okay, some people, so I'll show that. And so you can see that there's an instance that tagged as Bob, and there's an instance that is tagged as me. And so if Bob goes in here, and oh yeah, I'm going to live dangerously, he tries to terminate it, he gets an access denied. Okay? However, there's this instance over here that matches his owner tag, and he's able to start it. And in a minute or so, when that's actually up and running, I can show you him stopping it as well. So how did I do that? So there's two parts here. And I broke it out because I took all of the APIs, all the actions that don't support resource level permissions. Okay? And when I say that, what I mean is the resource has to be star. And so you need a separate block for them. If you don't give access to these APIs, once again, they're not going to be able to see anything in the console. Like, they want to be able to see a list of the instances. You have to grant them access to see a list of all of the instances. Now, for those, let's call it destructive actions, right? The ability to reboot, stop, start, or terminate. I'm granting Bob the ability to do that for all instances in US East, as long as there's a tag called owner that resolves to his name. And this is where the variable comes in handy, because I don't have to specify Bob. I don't have to specify Craig or Sally there. Whoever they are, it will be resolved. And so this is a single policy I can use for all of my developers that need to be able to manage their own instances. I think there's a question, and you may have missed. For the sake of going through, I'm going to take all questions at the very end. Okay? So I apologize about that. And so a couple things I'll point out. Once again, got to have the version. Okay? This top part is for seeing everything in the console that's necessary to do the job. And then these parts down here are where we check for the tag, and we have the variable that gets resolved to the user's name. Okay. Remember when we started? We had a goal of preventing a user from launching an instance unless it was one of those three types. Let's actually make it work this time. So in this case here, I'm going to remove him from the group. I'm going to attach a policy. And I'm going to attach this policy. And I'll show you this one. And this is a working policy that will actually do what we're supposed to do. So I'll show you the fail case and the success case again. I removed him, so he can't actually stop this anymore. Let's go ahead and launch an instance. We'll go through the exact same flow we did at the beginning. So I'm going to choose an M4. Just review and launch. And boom, we get the error case, right? So I'm going to copy that just because I'm going to use it in a second. But now I'm going to go back, and I'm going to choose the T2 micro. Yes. Review and launch. I acknowledge. Now you can see that Bob is able to launch instances of that type. So how did I do that, and why did this one work? And so I used a couple of the things that we talked about today. The first statement in here is a not action. And what I'm saying is you have the ability to call you have the ability to call everything but anything in IAM and the EC2 run instances API. Now the trick here is this grants everything but those two. So the user has access to S3, the user has access to Dynamo, SQS, you name it. And so if you don't want them to have access to that, you'd have to put a list of all the things you want to exclude. Okay? The next part here, this is what grants access to everything you need to launch an instance except the actual instance. So a lot of people forget that. When you launch an instance, you need a key pair, right? You need an AMI, you need a volume, you need all that stuff. And so here I'm using the not resource. Give them access to everything that is not an instance in these two regions. For this one, I chose to show US East and EU West. And now you want the ability to launch an instance in those regions, but only if the instance type is T1, T2, and T3. And the reason that this policy works and the other policy doesn't work is this instance type is a key that's only relevant to these two resources. And in the first policy that we tried to create, we were trying to check the instance type for something like a key pair or a volume. And the instance type is not relevant. It's not there. It's null. And so when it's null, the system doesn't know what to do with it. And so it treats it as a failure, i.e. it treats it as an access denied. And that's why the first policy failed and this one succeeded. Now this policy is kind of long, so I think I can make it even shorter. And I can do that if I take advantage of if exists. Now I'm sure there's a few of you who know what about if exists, but there's about this much documentation on it in the IAM docs, right? So let me explain it. So many condition keys exist only for certain resource types. And as I said with that first policy, if you try to test for a key that doesn't exist, your policy is going to fail. Now we have this little thing, it's the if exists, that you can append to any of the conditional operators except for null. And so you could take string like and turn it into string like if exists. And this is a lifesaver because what it allows you to do is create all sorts of policies where you're like, hey, test it, but if it's not there, I don't care. And so the policy, an even tighter, easier, better policy is this one, where I go and I allow access to all EC2 star, so I don't have to put any exception lists. I'm whitelisting all of EC2. But then I'm denying run instances for any instance, and in this case, any region, where the instance type, if it exists, is not like T1, T2, or T3. So this is the final policy that I actually gave to the customer, two-statement policy that solves that very simple use case. Yeah. All right, yeah, thank you. I don't think that one's in the documentation, so you can have that one. Maybe it will be by the time I get out. Now, there's a bunch of tools that we have for testing and debugging. We're getting down through the home stretch, so I might go through these a little bit quicker. We took a look at the policy editor, right? There's a couple things that we added into the policy editor that make life a little bit easier. We catch the JSON errors. We catch the policy grammar errors. You can check this little box down here so that it auto-formats it for you if you like the formatting that we provide. So it's kind of like a mini JSON policy IDE built into the management console. The other thing we have is the policy simulator. You can get to the policy simulator from the IAM console as well. And you can think of this as sort of a sandbox where you can test your policies. So you might not want to test them in production. And you can either import policies that are attached to users, groups, and roles, or you can author completely new policies. And then you put in the criteria around like the bucket I want to access or the table I want to access, and then you run a simulation. And it'll tell you if it's giving you the access, it gives you a result set, which will tell you if it's actually doing what you intended for that policy to do. Now, the one I want to spend more time on is decoding that EC2 authorization message. So remember that beautiful encoded output? Anyone ever wonder what that is or what you do with it? Yeah? Okay. There's actually a tool that we provide if you have access to call the STS decode authorization message to figure out what went wrong. And if you're creating an EC2 policy, this is what you need to use to figure out what you did not grant in order to make that policy work. And so let me just show you. I'm going to take that weird looking red message and I'm going to determine what caused an EC2 authorization failure. Now the good news is we already have a bunch of those, right? So I think if I go back in, I still have it in, yep, I have it in my clipboard. And what I did is I just created a little batch file for simplicity. And what it's using is the AWS command line tool, and I'm calling the STS decode authorization message. Oops, not intended. And I'm sending it that encoded message that I got from the EC2 console. And then I'm just piping it into a text file and dumping it to Notepad so that you can see it. Now, this in itself is not very human readable. So I do a couple things. Like first, I delete this little wrapper, and I don't know why it's there, but it is. And I delete it. And then there's all these forward slash, and I get rid of those. Just turn those into, oops, quotes. So it's a little bit better. But then if you're like me, I just take this and I dump it into my favorite JSON editor. I'm just using JSON lint. and then it formats it, and now it's something that I can read. And you can go through here, and it tells you things like who was it. Of course, it was Bob, right? And he's trying to call run instances, and here's the conditions that we set. And then somewhere in here it says, yeah, the set of failures, and these are all the failures that went through. And you can walk through this lovely JSON document. You can see that I tried to launch an M4 instance, and that's what caused the failure. And so this is how you get something that is human readable that will actually point you in the direction of what you need to correct in your policy. And I did an entire blog post on this as well, if you're interested. Okay, let me wrap up with policy enforcement. So when we evaluate policies, okay, first we start with a deny. By default, you try to access things, we just assume you're going to be denied. And we go through them, we collect all the policies that could apply to the request. So maybe you're requesting an object from S3, and there's a bucket policy, and there's a policy attached to the user, and the user is also a member of a group. We take all that policy, all that JSON goodness, and we evaluate it all at the same time, and we evaluate it equally, okay? And only the policies that match what you're trying to do will get evaluated. And so we evaluate all those applicable policies, and we look for a deny. This is an important step. If there is a deny for what you're trying to do, final decision is deny, and that's it. Now, however, is there an allow? Now, if there's an allow, and there's not a deny, then the final decision is allow, and you get access to that resource. However, if there's no deny and there's no allow, we go back to step one, which is really the final decision is default deny. And so this is how all of those policies are evaluated. Okay, we got to the end. So here's a summary. Don't get up yet. Don't get up yet. Don't get up. Got some other stuff in here. Surprises for people who stay. So IAM provides, access control to your account, right? We know now that the heart of that is the policy language. As we just took a look at, policies are denied by default, and denies always trump allows. Use policy versions, and this is the last time I'm going to say it. Use policy variables, and this is the last time I'm going to say it. Put a version in there if it's not going to work. Use managed policies, please. They make all of our lives easier. And then keep in mind what EC2 actions are supported, because if you try to use an EC2 action that doesn't support resource level permissions, you're going to get an access denied. Now, I humbly request that you fill out your evaluations. They help us improve the conference. They help me improve as a speaker, which you obviously know I need. There's a couple other sessions. So one of them happened yesterday. And if you don't have a DeLorean or you don't understand that cultural reference, those will be posted online at some point onto YouTube. Though there is a session at 1:30 around Federation, which I think dovetails with permissions very well, that I encourage you to go through. And then the last thing I'm going to do, because they're long and hairy, are these URLs where you can get to the documentation, the security blog, our homepage, the forum where I hang out, and our Twitter ID. And with that, thank you very much.